How you doing there? Reverend C.S. Millender II, back for another resounding round of reading of my illustrious work, the Omnavarian Codex, Antichrist Revealed. Now, in this video, we're going to go ahead and do a dramatic read of chapter number 3, entitled The Cold. But before we do that, I'm going to briefly review what we learned in chapter number 2. Now, for a lot of people, there's going to be a big reveal in chapter number 2, and that the Antichrist played a role in the creation of man. But really, that's not a reveal at all. If you understand the story of Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis, you know that evil very much played a role in the creation of man as it is today. Now, if we look in the book of Genesis, there's not one, but two creations of man. People just don't notice that. The first creation of man is in chapter 1, verse 27. Second one is in chapter 2, verse 7. Now, chapter 2, verse 7 is more fleshed out and explained. You know, God created man from the dust of the earth, and then he created Eve from a rib, it said, from a rib of Adam, in order to be his helper. However, if we look a little bit deeper into the Hebraic text and actually begin to understand what it actually means, what it actually seems to say is that God created man, and then from man's side, not rib. See, that word that's used there can mean either rib or side, but from the side of man to craft woman. And that word that meant helper is actually more accurately translated as rescuer. So God created woman to be a rescuer for man. Now, that first creation of man, if we go back into it, that's not really fleshed out at all in the book of Genesis. It just sort of mentions that God created man, both man and woman alike. Now, that's something. So if we go ahead and take a deeper dive into it, we can't really find too much to do with that in the book of Genesis, but we can find much more about the original creation of man played out in chapter 1, verse 27, in a book called the Zohar. Now, the Zohar is an archaic text that's found in the system of Kabbalism. In the Zohar, it says that God made Adam Kadmon as a vesselless being of light in order to be his true reflection. Now, unfortunately, I feel like the field of M theory, that's unified superstring theory, is largely understudied. But in there we find extraspatial realities. Some people inaccurately say spatial realities. That's not how it works, honey. But I'm only saying that so you help to understand it. But these are extra-dimensional spaces, extra-dimensional objects, and extra-dimensional beings. Some people might be familiar with a hypercube or a tesseract. But the simple fact of the matter is, if any being existed on a higher dimensional plane, to us, they would appear as vesselless. They would be this vesseless, ever-changing, dynamic, kind of being that we couldn't really put we couldn't draw a picture of, we couldn't really conceptualize. Now, understanding that the first 5 books of the Bible were delivered to Prince Moshe, generally known better today as Moses, in visions delivered by the angel of the Lord. Most believe that was Metatron. He wrote down what he could write down. He understood as he understood. So to him, the original creation man would be vesseless. It would just be this being of light, something he really couldn't fully describe if they were of a higher dimensional plane and existed in a higher dimensional existence. So really the fact of the matter is, I believe that this eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil was more metaphorical than anything else. That perhaps God created man in a higher dimensional state. And then we obtain some knowledge, like you might say a fount of knowledge or something like that. We obtain some kind of knowledge from this version of evil, whatever you want to call it. And that desecrated that form, so we became as we are today. Now, understanding that a little bit better helps you to understand that, not that, again, much of what we learn is simply culturally designed. Many of the cultures that existed before our own very much disregarded women. So, if they could choose between a side of man to create women or a rib of man, they're going to choose the lesser of the options. If they can choose between a rescuer for man or a helper of man, they're going to choose the lesser of the options, and they're going to become a helper. Okay? Just because you're a woman doesn't mean that you aren't equal to man. You might have different roles to play, obviously. But still, in God's eyes, you're a part of His creation. Man is a part of His creation. And ultimately, we've been desecrated in some manner, some form, by this knowledge of evil that became a portion of us. It became a part of us. And unfortunately, in today's world, now, to make it in this world, to be successful, we have to become a mixture of good and evil. And really, I believe that in of itself is why that Jesus Christ Himself called Satan the God of this world, the ruler of this world. So, I'm here to ask you, is the God of this world your God also? Or perhaps, do you serve a higher authority? And with that thought, let us move forward into chapter 3, entitled, The Code. If I am to be honest, it took a great deal of time before I encountered humanity again. While I had a great deal of love for the Omna from which you are partially created, seeing you was a constant reminder that they were no longer with me. So I chose to roam the lands and see what had become of this world. During my journeys, I ran across so many wonderful animals that were truly engaging and welcoming to me. Oh, while time has diminished my memories a bit, I will never forget how hilarious the tree slugs were. As it turns out, these little guys were the reason that the jackals were always laughing. I know most people think that monkeys are the funniest animal, and that's just because you don't speak their language. And if you did, you would not want to hear what they have to say. They are some of the most profane creatures I've ever had the misfortune of engaging in conversation, but tree slugs are the real comedians of the animal kingdom. Oh, most of you would never know it, but a simple little slug will spend weeks wandering about just to find someone to tell a good joke to. I still remember this one about a snapping turtle and a snapper that snapped back. I was laughing for a week. If there's one singular thing I miss most about my former form, it's most certainly chatting with those guys. Oh, forgive the distraction for the moment. When you've lived as long as I have, it's quite easy for nostalgia to take hold. As for humanity, while I had caught sight of you from time to time, it was several thousand years before I sought out one of your conclaves again. The weather had turned rather cold, and while I feared that my sadness at the loss of the Omna would overtake me, my fears for your survival were much stronger. Through the cold of winter's harshest snow, I sought you out, and what I found was a man named Takar. The moment I arrived, I saw this man surrounded by wolves, holding a spear in the frail hopes of surviving their attack. I raced to Takar's side and spoke with the wolves. Like most of the animals of this time, they were tired, hungry, and in desperate need of help. Which is why I suppose they were so receptive to the offer I made them. I asked that instead of devouring this man, that they aid him in his task. I assured them that if they helped man in this time, that man would forever be grateful, and ensured that they and their lineage would surely be taken care of by man. With him in agreement, they laid down their heads before Takar, and somehow he seemed to know what had transgressed. Takar took me and the wolves back to his home, a damp, cold cave carved into a mountainside. When I saw his family, a wife and beautiful little girl, dirty and hungry, huddled around a small fire for warmth, I shed a tear and knew that my leaving mankind to its own devices all this time had not simply been for the sentiment of my loss. It was selfishness. Because I was grieving the loss of my beloved Omna, I knew that their lineage die off in the unpredictable climate of a world transformed by the rage of God. For this I am truly sorry. Takar's daughter's name was Lilith, a delicate little girl not more than 2 years of age at the time. I recall our first meeting well. Takar arrived with 6 wolves and a jackal at his side. His wife took one look at us, let out a terrified shriek, and ran the other way, while her daughter managed to escape her grasp and came right up to me and gave me the sweetest little hug I have ever received, and even kissed me on my nose. I loved her instantly, and the feeling was entirely mutual. While the idea of keeping ferocious beasts around to help took some time for Takar's clan to accept, Lilith loved having me and the wolves to play with. In her, I saw that my Omna were indeed not dead. They had simply evolved into something wonderful and new. In time, my gambit did pay off. Man and beast were working together, and survival, at least of Takar's clan, was no longer an issue. The hunters would run off in the morning with the wolves and bring back a feast. Soon word spread of the legions, both among the wolves and man, and more began to arrive, creating a wonderful community. Of course, with so many people, a power structure naturally emerged, and because he was the one who had brought forth the communion between man and beast that created the abundance for the clan, at least as far as the people knew, Takar became their king, the first in mankind's history. Although his official title was something more akin to a first man of the clan. Yes, yet, while I enjoyed Takar, it was his daughter whom I saw the most potential in. Lilith was as fearless as she was smart. I felt that she might well be the perfect mouthpiece for me to impart the teachings of the Omna to humanity. Being that Lilith was so very young when we first met, it was rather easy to teach her how to communicate with me. Indeed, by the time Lilith was the mere age of 7, she was capable of speaking not only to me, but to all animals, and many of the plants as well. I taught her much, and I was her most treasured possession. As Lilith's mentor, I taught her many of the sciences performed by the Omna, lessons in manifestation, and understanding of the worlds that exist beyond your traditional perception. Lilith used the lessons that I bestowed upon her and passed many of them on to the others, creating healers, scholars, and inventors. Oh, by the time she reached the age of 10, she was her father's most trusted advisor. And when her father passed, she became a great queen to her people, at the yet still tender age of 17. While Lilith excelled at all that I would teach, she was most proficient at divination, the science of seeing beyond the veil of time. While the Omna could rather easily perform divination, as they were the ones who created the veil in the first place, it was rarely practiced among them, as there is little use in seeing the future when you live in paradise. The world Lilith was brought into, however, was far from the paradise that once had been. So she worked hardest at foreseeing the events that could bring harm to her or her subjects. As queen, Lilith would spend hours each day practicing her skill of divination, learning to see farther and farther into the future, until one day she foresaw her own death. While Lilith's death was yet many years away, her vision spurred her to perform unthinkable actions. Realizing that she would not always be there to protect her people, she sought out a way in which to be certain that her people would always enjoy the protection and prosperity that had been brought forth by her and her family. Despite my advising her against it, she sent out an autocratic decree that among her people that all the children who had yet to achieve the age of 5 would come to her and be trained in the ways of the wise. She assumed that simply reaching a child early enough would allow her to control their actions. I, on the other hand, knew all too well that because humanity contained among its components the absolute destructive power of the Figaro, that passing on these teachings to one that contained more Figaro than Omna could prove detrimental to humanity's survival. You see, up until mankind, the Figaro was never given consciousness, so I hadn't a clue what damage it could do until Lilith began teaching those children. When I taught Lilith, I had but one simple rule: understanding before action. Sensing her mortality, Lilith seemed to disregard this rule and simply taught the children to do as she could. While most could never achieve her level of proficiency, there was one among her students that truly showed excellence in the craft of the wise. I must admit, I was pleased that, at least for the most part, Lilith's attempt to impart the knowledge I had passed on to her into the next generation had failed. Yet, this girl, who had caught on so quickly, disturbed me. The one to whom Lilith had successfully taught my lessons to was named Mamiva, although she always preferred to be called Eve. The girl took hold of the lessons taught by Lilith with little effort, and it wasn't long before Eve had surpassed her teacher in almost all categories of study. As Eve advanced in her lessons, we began to understand that her real talent lay in influencing the forces of nature. When Lilith saw this, she seized the opportunity to work with the girl to alleviate the coldness that had plagued the region for generations. The two spent nearly a year communing with nature, seeking a way in which to warm the earth, when one day a snake ran across Mamiva's thigh, slithered up her chest, wrapped itself around her neck, and whispered into her ear that he had indeed found a way to cleave the cold from the land. The snake's solution was a sword, a special sword that would be crafted from the rib of a living man, and fused with the fires of the earth, cooled by the air, and shaped by the flow of a river. In this way, her soul would be imbued with the power of nature itself, and capable of carving the cold from the land. Once this sword was crafted, it was to be plunged into the earth, allowing the user to separate anything that they desired from the lands. Eve ran to Lilith with the news that she had found the solution that they had been seeking, with the snake still wrapped around her neck. Of course, when Lilith heard that the solution Eve had would require the life of one of her people, she refused to proceed with the plan. I had hoped that this would finally end the allegiance that Lilith had with Eve. But Eve was far too crafty for that. When Lilith rejected the idea, she turned to Lilith's chief advisor, Aton, who was always at her side, and without an ounce of deterrence, ripped open his chest, cracked off one of his ribs. Eve held up the bone and proclaimed, "With this, we shall be free of this cold. Save him if you must, but it will only show your people how weak you are." Lilith stood frozen by the actions of Eve, but in a moment grabbed Aton and laid her hands upon his chest, trying with all her might to heal the immense wound. Lilith's ability to heal was truly put to the test that day. But her actions were not in vain. Aton's wound was healed. The act of healing Aton came at a great cost, however. Lilith was severely weakened, to the point where she was forced to take leave of her duties as queen to rest. Lilith lay on the ground and slept for nearly a month, restoring herself, wakened only by Aton every few days to ensure that she drank and ate. As Lilith's chief advisor, Aton took on the duties of the queen while she lay resting. He stationed 10 of the strongest men in the clan at the entrance to Lilith's cave to ensure that no one disturbed the sleeping queen. For her actions, he was kept under close guard while the queen was sequestered, and the people waited for their queen's judgment. When Lilith finally awakened from her slumber and emerged from the cave, it was anticipated that she would call for the death of Eve. Instead, Lilith announced to her people that while she had slept, she had visions of the future far and beyond her lifetime. Great and monumental tasks taken on by humanity, and among them all she saw a grand statue of herself, enduring the ages, ensuring that she had done something so great that she would forever be remembered, and she was convinced that her great work would be cleaving the cold from her hand. With that pronouncement, she released Eve from her guard, and the two began their work. Lilith knew that the task of crafting the sword would take her away from her people for a great length of time, so it fell to her to select someone to lead in her absence. Due to his loyalty and years of service, Aton seemed to be the perfect person to act as her regent. To cement his claim to the leadership among her people, Lilith took Aton as her husband, making him king of the clan of Takara. Once her marriage was consummated, Lilith set forth on her journey to fortify the rib with Eve at her side. Lilith and Eve were more than formidable when the two worked together, and Lilith garnered the aid of the animals for the two during their travels, enabling them to cross vast expanses of land with great speed. The two rode atop horses, bears, tigers, lions, and goats to reach the first stop on their quest, the top of a fiery volcano. At the volcano, Lilith held the bone high above her head in her right hand, while Eve used her persuasion over the natural forces to pull up the flames, charring, hardening, and straightening the bone. Once the task of the flame was completed, it took up residence in the bone. The flame heated the bone so hot that Lilith's hand was scorched from the touch of the bone. In her hand, tears streamed from Lilith's eyes, and she let out a terrifying scream. But she refused to let go of it until the ceremony was complete. Once the flame rested in the bone, Lilith used all her strength not to drop the bone upon the land. The instructions from the snake were quite clear. The bone must be cooled by the air. The pain was fast becoming overbearing for Lilith, so she did the only thing she could think to do in her agony-induced delirium. She ran to a cliff, and with all her strength, leapt into the air. Releasing the bone from her grasp mid-air, she cried out to all the creatures that roamed the skies to not let her perish. Lilith's cry might have gone unnoticed by the birds. But despite my disapproval of her working with Eve, I still thought of her as my child, and a good father never stops watching over his little girl, no matter how she may behave. When Lilith left with Eve, I asked a few of my friends to watch over her as she made her journey. Well, if I am to be honest, I asked many of my friends to watch over the girls. Fortunately for Lilith, many of the animals enjoyed the hilarity of the tree slugs as much as I did. During the gatherings that would ensue as those slugs told their jokes, I made many friends among the eagles, hawks, and owls. Before Lilith left, I asked an eagle to allow me the use of his eyes, so that I might see the ladies as they made the journey. And this was a singular act that spared the life of Lilith. While Lilith was rather skilled at speaking with animals, she neglected one particularly important rule of this world. For the sake of argument, let's call it gravity. Rather simply, what goes up must come down. The part that Newton left out was what goes down must come up. Not that I blame him, for the second part is almost always subject to significant passage of time and variations in the object's molecular density, but still, it's quite true. When Lilith leaped from the cliff, she let out a cry that would be heard by the birds, but all too late. When I saw what was happening, I lay my head down and called out to the earth to summon up all the birds of flight to save my beloved Lilith. As Lilith fell, the earth below began to rattle, and the birds flew out from their resting place among the trees. The strongest of the birds ascended to her aid, clutching her shoulders, legs, back, and arms in their claws, and glided her to the ground, injured, but alive. The bone that had left her grasp was delivered to her left hand by a raven, sufficiently cooled by the air. After her tumultuous trip down the mountain, Lilith was spent, and she slept right where she was laid by the birds, while I did not wish to interfere with her matters any further. I couldn't let my dear girl lay there, cold and hurt. So I sent a bear and her cubs to surround her as she slept to provide her warmth. As for Eve, who was still atop that mountain, with that accursed snake wrapped around her neck, for nearly killing Lilith twice now, I considered ending her existence right then. The problem was, Eve was the only one with the skill to heal Lilith's wounds. Loving someone in this world is truly a complicated thing. And while we never want to see someone we love in pain, sometimes pain is the best thing for them. This is a lesson that I eventually came to learn. I did allow Eve to live in order to heal Lilith, but it was a decision that I quickly came to regret. Without Lilith's aid, Eve had a bit of trouble making her way down the mountain. While Eve could commune with nature, her spirit was not well received by many animals, so few were willing to offer their services to her alone. Eventually, Eve did make her way down the mountain and found Lilith amongst the bears that I had sent to take care of her. When Eve next saw Lilith, she was among the bears, happily eating berries that the mother had brought to her. Eve felt relieved that Lilith had managed to survive the fall, and somehow even managed to keep track of the bone. Eve apologized for her actions and healed Lilith's injuries, restoring her for the final leg of their journey. Lilith gave thanks to her bear host before she left in search of a river whose flow was strong enough to shake the sword. As she walked away with Eve, Lilith whispered a small thank you to me as well. As much as I tried to hide my influence in her affairs, she was always a clever girl, and she knew me far too well. While finding a river would prove no test for Lilith and Eve, finding one that had a strong enough current to shape a sword was quite the challenge. The two wandered the landscape for quite some time before one of them thought to ask for directions. I am labored to say that it was Eve's idea to do so, but truth be told, my Lilith could be a touch stubborn when it came to asking for help. In their search, even Lilith came across the largest tree that they had ever seen, so large that they could live inside, towering overhead at least 100 meters. When Eve saw this tree, she knew that it must be connected to a mighty water source, so she got the idea to ask the tree where its water source resided. If Eve had any virtues at all, it would be her level of patience. You see, vegetation can speak to you, but it tends to do so very slowly. Eve asked her question of the tree and waited for the answer. Hours went by, days passed, and finally, on the 7th day, a small change in the tree gave them that answer. A small nub in the base of the tree pointed them in the direction of the water source. Imbued with the knowledge provided by the tree, Eve and Lilith set off for the river. When they finally reached the edge of the river, Eve told Lilith that this time she would take hold of the bone so that any consequences of shaping the sword would fall to her. Lilith readily agreed, knowing that even with a rapid current, a river would take an exceptionally long time to shape the charred bone into anything resembling a sword. Lilith handed the bone to Eve, who plunged into the river. At first, it appeared that Lilith was right. The process would take an exceptionally long time. But then Eve felt a sharp pain in her hand like a needle. At first, Eve thought she had been stung by an insect, but it happened again, and again, and again, until suddenly the bone burst into flames, engulfing her hand. Indeed, the air had cooled the bone, but it had not extinguished the fire that now resided within it. Eve stuck her entire hand with the bone into the river, hoping to quell the fire, but it burned still. The wind swirled out of the bone, uniting with the flames under the water, causing the water to turn and boil. The current became too strong for Eve, and she tried to pull back the bone from the water, but the whirlpool created by the convergence of elements was far too strong now. In an instant, Eve was dragged into the whirlpool, writhing in agony as she was boiled alive. Eve let out one last gargled scream before being sucked underneath the water, and just as suddenly as it all began, the water seemed to cease its movement. Lilith stood frozen in horror as Eve disappeared beneath the water. She had tried to reach Eve before the current overtook her, but in this she had failed. In her desperation, Lilith cried out for me into the ether. Lilith's cry reached me in her village and stunned me in my tracks. In all my time with the Omna and humanity, no one had ever asked for my aid. And worse yet, the very first time someone truly needed my help, I hadn't a clue as to how to provide it. I racked my mind as to what I could do to help Lilith. In my haze, I tried to see Eve through the eyes of the fish in the river, but all that were close enough to see what had occurred were killed by the ferocious fiery current. I finally found eyes that were at least close enough to see that Eve was no longer in the river. The whirlpool that the bone created drilled into the riverbed bed and pulled Eve deep into the ground beneath the flowing river. Taking the knowledge that Eve was in the ground, I attempted to speak to the earth, but before I could speak a word, the ground let out a great cry as a woman in childbirth then spat Eve at a shining, glistening, crystalline sword out of the river. As it turned out, all that had transpired was exactly as it was supposed to be. The river that was chosen contained a great many diamond deposits that now composed the sword. The bone was simply a piece of living being that could contain the 4 elements. Once it was infused with the flame of the earth and the winds, it only needed the power of water to heat and pressurize the diamonds to ensure that they could be formed into a sword, as in the open air these gems would simply burn, like the coal they came from. A truly magnificent process that I've only recently begun to share with your scientists, as silicate places so many limitations on your computing. Sorry, but I suppose it's probably best to complete this tale before I broach that topic. Eve landed unconscious on the soft riverside with the sword at her side. her right arm completely obliterated by the process of shaping the sword. Lilith ran to her side in the hopes of reviving her, but Eve's body was spent from her trauma she had just experienced in the riverbed, and she slept for days before awakening. Lilith remained at Eve's side all the while. She slept, trying with all the skills that I imparted in her to regenerate Eve's arm, but to no avail. When Eve awoke, she seemed unconcerned about her condition. She saw Lilith kneeling beside her, doing her best to heal the damage done by forging the sword. Eve reached up her left hand to stroke the side of Lilith's cheek and beckoned for her to stop. "This is not what we came here to do, my love. Take the sword and complete the task, so my sacrifice will not be in vain." Though many thousands of years have passed since, I will never forget those words said by Eve to my Lilith. For they were the last words heard by the sweet and gentle girl I had come to love. Lilith did as Eve requested, picked up the sword, and thrust it into the land. The earth began to quake, the winds picked up, and clouds parted, revealing the warming glow of the sun. In moments, the snow had melted all over the world, and warmth had indeed been restored to the lands. In the village, shouts of celebration and joy rang out among the people, for they knew that their queen had completed her quest and cleaved the cold from the land. It was indeed one of the most joyous moments of humanity, the likes of which I have rarely seen. Even I smiled, and for a moment I believed that perhaps I had been wrong about Eve. In an instant the world was restored, and all was well. Oh. But how quickly you forget. The one rule of this universe, that everyone, regardless of how powerful, must always obey. There must be balance. The coldness of all the lands rose up into the winds and collected above Lilith. Then they turned upon her. Without warning, all the cold that had gathered above Lilith entered her, freezing her inside and out instantaneously, and she was, as she foresaw, a frozen statue to stand for all the ages. Seeing what had become of Lilith, Eve stood up, unsurprised by what had just transpired. She walked over to what only moments before had been someone who considered her a friend, and smiled. Eve took the sword from where it stood in the ground and used her left arm to stab a tree, sucking the life out of it and granting her the ability to regrow her limb as the tree once could. Eve had known all along what the sword would do. It was told to her long before by that snake. But this was her plan, after all. Eve would use the death of Lilith to take her throne, her people, and her rightful legacy.